The day Ruby Baker walked into the Harlan County Courthouse with a bruise fading yellow along her jaw and a dead man's land deed folded in her apron pocket, she had no idea that the man leaning against the hitching post outside, the one with the dusty hat pulled low, and the quiet, watchful eyes, would end up being the only reason she left that building with anything left to fight for. It was the autumn of 1882 in Caldwell, Kansas, a cattle town that had seen more than its share of blood, lies, and land disputes. The air carried the smell of dry grass and distant rain, and the main street was packed with horses, wagons, and men who moved with the kind of purpose that came only from knowing exactly what they wanted. Ruby Baker was 31 years old, a widow of 6 months, and she had walked the 3 miles into town from her homestead alone because she could not afford to wait any longer. The man who had murdered her husband, or at the very least conspired in his death, was named Virgil Crane, and he sat at that very moment inside the courthouse with his lawyer from Wichita and a deed to her land that she was certain had been forged. Ruby was not the kind of woman who had ever thought of herself as brave. She had been a farmer's wife, then a farmer's widow. She cooked, she planted, she mended, and she kept the small house on the Baker homestead standing through 2 droughts and a prairie fire. She had brown hair that she kept pinned in a practical knot and green eyes that her late husband Thomas had once said were the color of new wheat just before it turned gold. Thomas had been a gentle man, a good man, and someone had put a bullet in him out on the east field and left him lying face down in the dirt like a discarded thing. The sheriff's investigation had lasted 4 days before he closed it, chalking it up to a drifter. Ruby had not believed that for a single moment. Virgil Crane had been pressing Thomas for months to sell the Baker land, which sat between Crane's sprawling cattle ranch to the west and the new rail depot being planned to the east. Thomas had refused. And then Thomas had turned up dead, and 2 weeks later a deed appeared at the land office with Thomas's signature on it, transferring the Baker homestead to the Crane Cattle Company. Ruby had no money for a lawyer. She had no family in Kansas. She had her own testimony, her husband's original deed, and the letter Thomas had written to her just 3 weeks before his death, describing Crane's threats in detail. She had carried all of that into the courthouse that morning, believing with every ounce of her heart that the truth was enough. She was wrong about that. Not about the truth, but about whether anyone would listen to it. The courthouse in Caldwell was a 2-story brick building that always smelled faintly of pipe smoke and old paper. The land dispute hearing was held in a small room on the ground floor with 6 wooden chairs for observers, a raised desk for the judge, and 2 tables facing each other for the opposing parties. Judge Elias Haverford sat behind that desk, a thin man in his 60s with small spectacles, and the particular expression of a man who has already made up his mind before the proceedings begin. Ruby sat alone at the left-hand table with her papers spread before her, and her hands folded so tight in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Across from her, Virgil Crane sat with his attorney, a polished man named Caldwell Fitch who wore a 3-piece suit and spoke in the long, unhurried sentences of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Crane himself was broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and wore the expression of someone watching a minor inconvenience he had already paid to have removed. Judge Haverford called the hearing to order. Fitch stood immediately and presented the deed with great ceremony, noting the date, the signature, and the notary stamp. He called his single witness, the land office clerk, who confirmed that the deed had been filed with all proper documentation. Then Fitch sat down with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed the matter concluded. Ruby stood up. She introduced herself clearly, stated her claim to the Baker homestead, and placed her copy of the original deed on the judge's desk. She explained the discrepancy in the dates. She spoke about Crane's repeated attempts to pressure Thomas into selling. She unfolded the letter, the one in Thomas's own handwriting, and began to read from it. Judge Haverford held up one hand. "Mrs. Baker," he said, in a tone that carried no particular cruelty but a complete and devastating indifference. "This is a land dispute proceeding. The deed presented by the Crane Cattle Company has been properly notarized and filed. You are a widow with no legal standing to challenge a notarized deed on the basis of a personal letter. Furthermore, your testimony as an interested party without legal counsel cannot be entered into the official record of this proceeding. I would advise you to seek proper representation and file a formal petition if you wish to contest the deed." Ruby stared at him. "Sir, this letter is in my husband's hand. He wrote it 3 weeks before someone killed him. He named Virgil Crane specifically." "Mrs. Baker." The judge's voice was patient in the way that only truly dismissive men could be patient. "A widow's testimony is not admissible in a property dispute of this nature without legal representation. That is the law of this court. I will not be entering your statement into the record." The air went out of the room. Virgil Crane smoothed the front of his coat. His lawyer made a small note on his paper. The land office clerk studied the floor. Ruby stood very still, and she felt something she had never quite felt before, a cold, hollow fury so complete that it had no room left in it for tears. She had known the world was not always fair. She had not known that unfairness could be this clean, this casual, this well-dressed. She gathered her papers with steady hands. She walked out of the room. In the hallway she stopped and pressed her back against the wall and breathed. The hearing was not over. The judge had not formally ruled yet, had recessed for an hour, but she had been dismissed as cleanly as if she had never walked through the door. The original deed in her hand, Thomas's letter in her pocket, and nowhere to put any of it. It was when she pushed through the courthouse's front door and stood blinking in the bright October sunlight that she almost walked directly into Graham Hadley. He caught her by the shoulders without thinking, a quick steadying grip, and then immediately released her and stepped back and touched the brim of his hat. "Beg your pardon, ma'am." Ruby looked up at him. He was tall, somewhere in his mid-30s, with dark hair going a little long under a weathered brown hat and a face that had spent a great deal of time in the sun. He wore trail clothes, practical and clean, and there was a quality about him that she would later struggle to name, not stillness exactly, but a kind of deliberate calm, as if he moved through the world at his own chosen pace and saw more of it than most people bothered to. "No harm," she said, and she would have walked past him entirely if her voice had not cracked slightly on the second word in a way that she absolutely had not intended. Graham Hadley's eyes went to her face. They were dark brown, those eyes, and they had the particular quality of someone who paid attention. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine." She straightened her back. "Excuse me." "You came out of the hearing room," he said. It was not a question. She stopped walking. "You were waiting out here." "I've got business at the land office next door." Couldn't help overhearing the raised voices. He paused, including the judge's voice, which carried considerably. Ruby turned to look at him fully then, and she studied him for a moment with the careful, unsentimental gaze of a woman who had learned not to accept things at face value. "He said my testimony could not be entered into the record." Something shifted in Graham's expression. It was brief but unmistakable, the particular kind of anger that quiet men carry, the kind that does not announce itself but runs deep and clean. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that I am a widow without legal representation in a property dispute." She heard herself say it, and the words sounded even more absurd spoken aloud than they had in that room. Graham was quiet for a moment. He looked at the courthouse door, then back at her. "You have a deed." "I have the original deed. The deed my husband signed in 1879 when he filed the homestead claim. I also have a letter he wrote to me describing the threats Virgil Crane made against him 3 weeks before he was killed." "Crane." Graham said the name flatly in a way that suggested it was not unfamiliar to him. "You know him." "I know of him. I've been in this county 6 weeks. Hard not to hear the name." He looked at the courthouse again, and she could see him thinking something through. Then he said, "The hearing is recessed. An hour, I believe." He nodded once slowly. Then he looked directly at her. "What's your name, ma'am?" Ruby Baker. My husband was Thomas Baker, the Baker homestead 3 miles east on the Caldwell Road. Graham Hadley. He put out his hand, and she shook it without hesitating because something in the directness of him made social formality seem entirely beside the point. Mrs. Baker, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer it honestly because the next step depends on the honest answer. All right. Do you have proof that deed was forged, not suspicion, actual proof? She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out Thomas's letter. She held it out to him. He took it carefully, as if he understood it was not merely paper but a kind of sacred object, and he read it. He read it twice. Then he folded it along its original crease and handed it back. Thomas Baker writes clearly, he said quietly. He did, she said, and the past tense settled over her like a familiar weight. Graham was quiet for another moment. Then he said, I know a man in this town. His name is Elroy Watts, and he is a licensed attorney in the state of Kansas, which means he is standing to file a motion in an active proceeding. His office is on the far end of the main street over the hardware store. He owes me a considerable favor. He paused. If you are willing to go to him right now, I believe we may be able to get your testimony into that record before the judge rules. Ruby stared at him. Why would you do that? It was a fair question. He was a stranger. She had been in his presence for less than 5 minutes. The Wild West was not a place where strangers typically intervened in other people's legal disputes without some angle of their own. Graham Hadley looked at her steadily. Because what that judge said is wrong, and because your husband sounds like a man who deserved better than what happened to him, and his widow deserves better than being walked out of a courthouse with nothing. He paused, and then he added, with a slight roughness that was the only indication he was speaking from somewhere personal, and because I have seen what happens when people with power use the law as a weapon against people who have none, and I made myself a long time ago the kind of man who does not walk past it. The words were not dramatic. He said them plainly, looking at her with those steady dark eyes, and they landed in Ruby Baker's chest with the weight of something absolutely true. She straightened her shoulders. Then let us go find Mr. Watts, she said. They walked quickly down the main street, and Ruby noticed the way people made small adjustments as they passed, a slight widening of the path, a brief settling of shoulders. Graham Hadley moved through the world with the quiet authority of a man who had earned it in ways she did not yet know. She did not ask. There was not time. Elroy Watts turned out to be a compact, energetic man in his early 50s, with ink-stained fingers and reading spectacles pushed up on his forehead like a second pair of eyes. His office above the hardware store was stacked with papers and law books, and he was eating a sandwich when they came through the door. Graham said, Elroy, I need that favor now. Elroy set down the sandwich and looked from Graham to Ruby and back. That's your opening. We have about 40 minutes before Judge Haverford reconvenes. This woman has been denied entry of testimony in her own land dispute hearing on the grounds that she lacks legal representation. She has a prior deed and a written statement from her late husband detailing coercion. I need you to file a motion to enter her testimony into the record and to challenge the chain of title on that notarized deed. Elroy was already reaching for his spectacles. Who's the opposing party? Crane Cattle Company, Virgil Crane. Elroy went very still for just a moment. Then he put his spectacles on his nose and reached for a clean sheet of paper. Sit down, Mrs. Baker, he said, and his voice had changed. It was faster now, more focused, carrying the particular energy of a man who understood exactly what was being asked and why it mattered. Start from the beginning. I need every date, every name, every piece of paper you are carrying. Do not leave anything out. Ruby sat. She began to talk. She talked about the Baker homestead, about Thomas's original claim, about the first time Virgil Crane had ridden up to their fence line in the spring of 1881 and offered them what had sounded like a generous price, but came with a particular pressure in his voice that made Thomas uneasy. She talked about the second offer, larger, more insistent, delivered by one of Crane's ranch hands in a way that was meant to feel like a warning. She talked about the letter Thomas had written to her from the East Field in September of 1882, the week before the harvest, the letter she had kept folded in the back of the Bible, the one that named Crane and named the threats and said in Thomas Baker's plain, careful handwriting that he intended to ride into Caldwell and speak to someone in authority if the pressure did not stop. He had not made it to Caldwell. He had made it to the East Field and no further. L. wrote everything down. He asked sharp, precise questions. Graham stood near the window with his arms crossed and did not interrupt, but once or twice he looked at Ruby with an expression that she could not quite classify. It was not pity, she was certain of that, because pity had a softness to it that this did not. It was something more like recognition, as if he saw in her something he understood. With 15 minutes to spare, Elroy Watts had a motion drafted. He reached for his coat. "Let's go remind Judge Haverford how Kansas law actually reads." They walked back to the courthouse together, all three of them, and Ruby felt something she had not felt since the morning she found Thomas in the East Field, the specific and terrifying feeling of hope. The hearing room was as they had left it. Crane and his lawyer were already seated, and when they walked back through the door, Caldwell Fitch looked up from his papers with the mild irritation of a man who had expected the nuisance to have removed itself. His expression changed when he saw Elroy Watts. Judge Haverford reconvened the hearing. Before the judge could do anything else, Elroy Watts rose. "Your Honor, I am Elroy Watts, licensed attorney at law in the state of Kansas, and I am appearing today on behalf of Mrs. Ruby Baker in this matter. I am filing a motion to enter her testimony into the record and to request an examination of the chain of title on the deed presented by the Crane Cattle Company." Haverford looked at Watts over his spectacles. "Mr. Watts, this hearing was already in progress." "Yes, Your Honor, and the relevant point is that it has not been concluded. My client is present, the proceeding is open, and she has the legal right to enter testimony through counsel." Elroy laid his papers on the judge's desk with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly which passages of Kansas property law were about to make the judge's morning considerably more complicated. I would also note that the deed in question was filed 14 days after the death of Thomas Baker, whose original homestead claim predates the Crane Cattle Company's claim by 3 years. Caldwell Fitch was on his feet. "Your Honor, this motion is highly irregular." "What is irregular," Elroy said pleasantly, "is a notarized deed bearing a dead man's fresh signature." The room went very quiet. Virgil Crane's jaw tightened. Haverford looked at the papers Elroy had placed before him, and something in his expression shifted, not guilt exactly, more the look of a man recalculating the terrain beneath his feet. "I will hear the motion," Haverford said. Graham Hadley, who had taken a seat in the back row of observer chairs and said nothing throughout this exchange, let out a slow, quiet breath. Ruby, seated now at her table with Elroy beside her, folded her hands in her lap again, but this time they were not shaking. Elroy entered her testimony into the record. He entered Thomas's letter into the record. He called attention to the 14-day gap between Thomas Baker's death and the deed's filing, pointing out that a valid transfer of land ownership typically required the living presence of both parties at the time of notarization. He asked the court to subpoena the notary who had stamped the deed. Caldwell Fitch objected at every turn with the smooth, relentless energy of a man being paid well to make obstacles. But Elroy Watts met every objection with a precise citation, and Judge Haverford, who was many things but not entirely without professional conscience, found himself in the uncomfortable position of being unable to dismiss a motion that was legally sound. The hearing was continued. No immediate ruling. Haverford set a date 3 weeks out, ordered the notary's appearance, and adjourned. It was not a victory, not yet, but it was the crack in the wall that Ruby had come there hoping to find. Outside the courthouse, Elroy shook Ruby's hand and told her he would begin preparing a formal challenge to the deed's chain of title, that she should come see him on Friday with any additional documentation she had, and that he was genuinely looking forward to making life complicated for Caldwell Fitch. Then he was gone, back up the street to his office, already muttering about case notes. Ruby stood on the courthouse steps in the October sunlight and felt the particular, exhausted relief of a person who has been holding their breath for a very long time. Graham was a few steps behind her. She turned and looked at him. "Thank you," she said, and the words were entirely inadequate and she knew it. "Elroy did the work," he said. "You brought him. You spent your favor on a woman you didn't know." He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his eyes that she noticed for the first time in the aftermath of the urgency. A kind of careful quality, as if he were used to guarding something and was not quite sure what to do with the impulse to lower that guard. "You had the evidence," he said. "You had the truth. All I did was make sure someone with legal standing was in the room to say so." "That is not a small thing," Ruby said quietly. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." They stood for a moment on the steps while the town moved around them, horses and wagons and the distant sound of a hammer from somewhere down the street. Then Ruby said, "May I ask what your business is in Caldwell, Mr. Hadley? You said you've been in the county 6 weeks. "Cattle work," he said. "I've been working the trail drives for a while, mostly the Kishom. Got a job this season with the Miller operation northeast of town. The drive finished last month and they kept me on through the winter for fence work and general management." "You're a cowboy," she said. "I have been," he said, and there was something in the slight pause before it that she filed away without quite knowing why. "Among other things." She nodded. She looked down the road toward the edge of town in the direction of the 3-mile walk back to the homestead. She had not eaten since early morning, and the reality of the day was beginning to settle into her bones like the particular weariness that follows sustained fear. "I should get back," she said. "I have animals that need seeing too." Graham looked down the road. "You walked in this morning." "I did." He did not make a fuss about it, which she appreciated. He simply said, "I have a horse at the post. I'll ride with you as far as the Caldwell Road junction if you don't mind the company." She looked at him. He met her look evenly, without apology or performance. She thought about Thomas, who had been the same way, direct, without pretense, offering things simply because they were reasonable offers to make. "I don't mind," she said. They walked to the hitching post together, and he untied his horse, a bay with a calm, sensible look about him. He walked alongside Ruby on foot, leading the horse, and they moved out of town into the dry October countryside together. The grass on both sides of the road was the color of old straw, and the sky was that specific wide Kansas blue that felt like something you could fall into if you looked at it too long. They talked. Not about the hearing at first, they had both had enough of the hearing. Graham asked about the homestead, and she told him about it with the particular combination of pride and grief that she had not fully put into words before. How she and Thomas had built the house themselves in the summer of 1879, how the Eastfield soil was black and rich, and how Thomas had said every spring that it was the finest growing soil he had ever seen. She told him about the chickens they kept, and the small kitchen garden, and the 2 draft horses that were the most expensive things they owned and the most valuable. Graham listened in the way that very few people listen, without preparing his response, without looking away, with a focused and genuine attention that made her feel that what she was saying mattered beyond the words themselves. She asked about him in turn. He had been raised in Missouri, he said, the youngest of 4 brothers. He had gone west at 18, first to work cattle in Texas, then up the trail drives, learning the land the way you could only learn it by moving through it in every season. He had been in the New Mexico territory for 2 years working horse management for a large outfit there, then had drifted north into Kansas following the cattle money. He was 34 years old and had, he said with a quality in his voice that was neither self-pity nor performance, never quite stayed in one place long enough to put down roots. "Why not?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know that I've fully worked that out," he said honestly. She looked at him. There was something appealing about a man who answered a question with a genuine uncertainty rather than a ready-made story. They reached the junction of the Caldwell Road, where the eastward fork led to the Baker homestead and beyond it toward Wichita. Graham stopped with the horse and looked down the east road. "How much land?" he asked. 320 acres, she said. "The house and barn and kitchen garden sit on the north quarter. The east field is the best of it. That's the one Thomas was plowing when." She stopped. "Crane wants it because it sits between his grazing land and the depot site. He needs it for the cattle corridor. Without it, his operation loses its most direct route to the rail." "Which is why he's not going away," Graham said. "Which is why he is not going away," she confirmed. "Even if Elray wins the deed challenge, Crane will look for another way. He has money and he has people in this county." Graham looked at her steadily. "Do you have anyone looking after the property while you're in town?" She shook her head. "There's just me." Something in him settled in a particular way then, and it was not a dramatic thing, but she noticed it. "I'll be back at the Miller operation by dark," he said. "But the Miller place is only about 2 miles north of your junction. If anything happens, if anyone comes on that property who ought not to be there, you send word to the Miller operation and I will come." Ruby looked at him for a long moment. "You don't owe me that." "No," he said, "but I'm offering it anyway." She held his gaze and then she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Hadley." "Graham," he said simply. "Graham," she said, and it felt like something, the saying of his name, though she could not have explained why. She turned and walked the east road toward home, and she did not look back, but she heard the sound of the bay horse standing still at the junction for a long moment before the hoofbeats moved north, and something about that stayed with her through the whole walk home. The 3 weeks before the continued hearing passed in the way of difficult time, simultaneously too fast for comfort and too slow for sanity. Ruby worked the homestead through the autumn, doing what she had always done: feeding animals, maintaining fences, preparing the soil for the winter dormancy, preserving what remained of the late garden vegetables. The work had a grounding quality that she had always been grateful for, the way physical labor had a way of keeping the mind anchored when it wanted to spin off into fear. She saw Graham Hadley 4 times in those 3 weeks, and each time was distinct and alive in a way that made the days between them feel a little more textured by comparison. The first time was 2 days after the hearing, when he appeared on horseback at the far end of her lane, 2 miles from the Miller operation, holding his hat in his hand and asking whether she would be willing to show him the East Field. The East Field Thomas had written about, the one that Crane wanted badly enough to kill for. He said he wanted to understand the geography of it, the full scope of what was at stake, and Ruby understood that what he meant was that he wanted to understand the full scope of what she was fighting for. She walked him through the East Field in the gray afternoon light, and she told him about Thomas's plans for it. The new crop rotation he had been reading about in an agricultural journal sent up from St. Louis. The irrigation ditch he had wanted to dig the following spring. The particular pride he took in those 320 acres that were theirs in a way nothing had ever been theirs before. Graham walked beside her through the dry stubble of the finished harvest, and he asked about the soil and the drainage and the slope of the land, practical questions, and she answered them. And at some point in the walking and the talking she realized that the East Field had not felt like a battlefield for that hour. It had felt like land again. When they reached the fence at the eastern boundary, Graham stood looking out at the long, flat reach of Kansas ground toward the horizon. "It's good land," he said, with the blunt honesty of someone who had seen a great deal of land and knew the difference. "It's the best we had," she said, and this time the past tense did not break anything. It just settled clean and acknowledged. He looked at her. "You said had. Force of habit," she said after a moment. "It's still mine. I intend to keep it that way." He smiled then, not a broad smile, just a small shift at the corner of his mouth that changed his whole face, made it warmer and younger. "I believe that," he said. The second time she saw him was the following week, when he came with a length of good fence wire she had not asked for but had clearly needed, and he spent the better part of a morning repairing the north quarter's fence line that had been sagging since late summer. He refused payment and deflected her protest with the simple observation that a fence in poor repair was an invitation to trouble, particularly given her current circumstances, and that he had the time and the wire and there was no reasonable argument against it. She made him coffee and they sat on the porch steps in the afternoon sun drinking it, and she asked him about the trail drives, about the great cattle drives up the Kishom Trail that had been the lifeblood of Kansas for the last decade and a half, and were now beginning to taper off as the railroads pushed south and made the long drives less necessary. He talked about it with the particular quality of someone who had lived inside a thing long enough to know both its grandeur and its difficulty. The weeks on the trail, the river crossings, the stampedes that came from nothing, a flash of lightning or an unexpected smell, and 10,000 cattle suddenly in motion. He talked about the night watches, the sky over the open plains so crowded with stars that you could read by them if you were patient, and the way the silence of those nights was not empty but full, layered with the sounds of the land. Ruby listened and thought about the smallness and largeness of lives, the way Thomas's life had been contained in 320 acres and Graham's had sprawled across half a continent, and how neither was lesser for the difference. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The drives," he considered. "I miss the scale of it," he said. "The way you couldn't see the end of what you were part of. But I don't miss the rootlessness as much as I used to think I did." She looked at him and found him already looking at her, and they both looked away at the same moment, back out at the yard, and neither of them said anything about that for the rest of the afternoon. The third time was shorter. He came to tell her that Elroy Watts had located the notary who had stamped the Crane deed, a man named Prescott who worked out of a small office in Wichita, and that Elroy had reason to believe Prescott was going to be a very uncomfortable witness under oath. He delivered this information with a restrained but genuine satisfaction, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands, and Ruby felt a surge of something so close to relief that she had to steady her breathing. "Elroy is good," Graham said. "He will take care of it." "He's been good," she agreed. "I owe him considerably." "He is billing you at a rate that accounts for your circumstances," Graham said, with a slight careful quality that told her he had had something to do with that arrangement, though she suspected he would deny it if she pressed. She did not press. She was learning which battles to choose. The fourth time was the evening before the continued hearing, and it was the one that she thought about later with the particular texture of something that had changed the direction of a life. He came in the last hour of daylight and he brought nothing with him, no fence wire, no news, no errand, and when she opened the door and saw him standing on the porch in the low amber light, hat in hand, she understood that he had simply come. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said, "before tomorrow." "I'm all right," she said. And then, because it was the evening before a day that might determine whether she kept her home or lost it, and because she was genuinely tired of performing more composure than she felt, she added, "I am nervous." "That's reasonable," he said. "I keep thinking about what happens if it doesn't go well, if Elroy can't make it stick. Crane finds another way to pressure the court." She stopped. "I know I should think more positively." "Thinking about the worst possibility isn't weakness," Graham said. "It's just honest." He paused. "But I've been watching Elroy Watts work for nearly a week now, and I'm telling you that notary is going to fall apart on the stand. I know the type. He's not a hard man. He was paid to do something he knew was wrong, and he's been uncomfortable about it ever since." He looked at her with those steady dark eyes. "You have the truth, Ruby, and you have evidence, and you have a good lawyer. That combination is worth something." She noticed he had called her Ruby without the misses, and she noticed that she was glad he had. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Always." She studied his face in the fading light. "Why did you stay? After you brought me to Elroy after the hearing that first day, you could have gone back to the Miller operation and considered your part done. Instead you've been here. Why?" Graham was quiet for a moment that was full rather than empty. Then he said, "I told you I'm trying to work out why I never stayed in one place." "You did say that." "I think I might be working it out a little faster than I expected." The amber light fell across his face and hers, and the October evening air was cool and still, and Ruby Baker felt something that she had told herself she would not feel again for a very long time, possibly ever, a quickening, a warmth, a particular aliveness in the chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the living. She did not reach for it. She let it stand between them like something both of them could see but neither needed to name yet. "Come inside," she said instead. "I'll make supper and you can tell me more about the Kishom Trail." He came inside. She made supper: beans and cornbread and the last of the summer's preserved tomatoes, served at the small kitchen table where Thomas used to sit across from her, and Graham sat across from her in that same chair, and the world was complicated and tender and real. They talked for 2 hours, and then he rode north to the Miller operation in the dark, and Ruby stood at the window and watched the lantern light of his horse disappear up the road, and she pressed one hand briefly flat against the glass and felt entirely and specifically alive. The continued hearing arrived on a gray November morning, with a chill in the air that carried the first real promise of winter. Ruby and Elroy arrived early. Graham came in separately and sat in the back row of observer chairs, and when Ruby glanced back at him as she settled at the plaintiff's table, he gave her one small nod that steadied her more than any speech could have done. Caldwell Fitch was present with his full self-possession, and Virgil Crane sat beside him in his fine coat with the expression of a man who was mildly put out but not genuinely concerned. He had the confidence of someone who had made their arrangements. Ruby had seen that expression before, in the months after Thomas died, and it had made her ill. Today it made her something colder and more determined. The notary came first. His name was Prescott, Harold Prescott, and he was a small, thin man with nervous hands who walked to the witness stand as if it were a gallows. L. rose and began to question him with the patient precision of a man who knew exactly where this road led and was in no hurry to rush his witness off it. Prescott answered the early questions steadily enough. Yes, he was a licensed notary public. Yes, he was familiar with the deed in question. Yes, he had applied his stamp and signature to it. And then Elroy asked him to describe the circumstances of the notarization, specifically where it had taken place, who had been present, and whether Thomas Baker had been physically present to sign. The hands on the witness stand went still. Elroy asked again, with the same quiet courtesy, and Harold Prescott looked at his hands and then at the ceiling and then at the floor, and then he said, in a voice so low that Judge Haverford asked him to repeat himself, that Thomas Baker had not been present at the notarization. That a man he had never seen before had presented the document with Baker's signature already on it and had paid him $50 to stamp it, and that he had not asked questions because he had needed the money and had told himself it was a private matter between landowners, and had been telling himself something like that ever since, and it had not, he admitted, been working very well. Caldwell Fitch objected. Haverford overruled him. Elroy pressed forward. Prescott, the seal broken now, described the man who had brought him the document, not Crane himself, but one of his ranch hands, a man known locally as Deacon Stiles, who rode for the Crane Cattle Company and whose involvement in 3 separate unpleasant incidents in Harlan County was a matter of open, if unrecorded, community knowledge. Elroy then presented the date of Thomas Baker's death against the date of the deed's filing, the notarization date, and a sworn affidavit from the Caldwell undertaker attesting to the date of Thomas Baker's burial. The timeline was airtight. The deed had been notarized 2 days after Thomas Baker was in the ground. Caldwell Fitch tried for 20 minutes with everything he had, and he had considerable skill. But he was trying to defend a fraud before a judge who was now looking at a paper trail so clear it was almost impolite, and even the most polished advocacy could not undo what was written in ink on the records of 2 counties. Judge Haverford declared the deed presented by the Crane Cattle Company to be fraudulent in its origin and therefore void. He ordered the Baker homestead returned to the plaintiff in full. He stated that the matter of the original deed would be restored to official record, and that he was referring the matter of the fraudulent notarization to the appropriate authorities for further proceeding. He looked at Virgil Crane when he said this last part, and his expression carried the particular weight of a man who was aware that he should have moved faster the first time. Ruby sat very still for a moment after the gavel came down. Then she picked up the original deed from the table in front of her and held it in both hands, and she breathed. Elra clapped her on the shoulder. Across the room, Virgil Crane stood with a controlled and furious dignity and walked out without looking at her, his lawyer close at his shoulder. She heard later that Deacon Stiles was arrested within the week on charges connected to the fraudulent deed, and that Crane himself faced a formal inquiry, though the full weight of the law moved slowly in 1882, and powerful men had ways of cushioning their falls that ordinary people did not. The investigation into Thomas's death was reopened. It would take time, and it would not, ultimately, bring Thomas back. But the truth of what had been done to him was acknowledged now, written into the record of Harlan County, and that was not nothing. That was in fact a great deal. Ruby walked out of the courthouse into the cold November morning with her homestead deed in her hand and Elray Watts shaking her hand beside her and Graham Hadley coming down the steps behind them. And when she turned to look at him, he was smiling, a real smile this time, not the small corner-of-the-mouth version, but a full, open smile that transformed his face entirely, and the sight of it hit her somewhere completely unprepared. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she said firmly. "All three of us." Elray excused himself with the brisk good cheer of a man who had other cases demanding his time and was thoroughly satisfied with his morning's work. And then it was just Ruby and Graham on the courthouse steps, and the cold November air and the sound of the town around them. "Come have a meal with me," she said. It came out more directly than she had planned, but she did not regret it. "Please, it's the least I can offer." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, the slight pause, the deliberate weighing of things, the careful quality. Then, "Yes," he said simply. They ate at the small hotel dining room on the main street, the first proper meal she had allowed herself in months, with actual beef and fresh bread and hot coffee that cost considerably more than what she made at home but felt, on this particular day, entirely worth the expense. They talked for a long time, and the talk had a different quality now that the urgency was resolved. It was easier, freer, with more laughter in it than she had expected from either of them. He told her about a cattle drive in the spring of 1878, when the Cimarron River had risen overnight, and they had lost 3 days and gained a number of gray hairs trying to get 2,000 cattle across it. She told him about the summer of 1880 when a prairie fire had come within half a mile of the homestead, and she and Thomas had spent 16 hours soaking and beating the fire break with wet sacking, and had saved the east field by what Thomas called the stubbornest act of defiance against nature he had ever witnessed. They laughed at both stories, the particular deep laugh that comes from having been genuinely frightened and having come through it. And somewhere in the middle of it, between the coffee and the cold outside and the warmth of the room, Ruby looked at Graham Hadley across the table and understood with absolute clarity that this was a man she wanted in her life. Not as an obligation or a replacement or a remedy for loneliness, but as himself, this specific, quiet, steadfast, smiling man with the dark eyes and the life lived across half a continent, and the particular quality of attention he brought to everything he looked at, including her. She did not say any of that, not at the hotel table in the middle of Caldwell's Main Street on the day of the hearing. It was too soon and too raw, and she was still carrying Thomas's deed in her hand and the weight of the last 6 months in her bones. But she thought it, fully and clearly, and let it stand inside her like something she would tend carefully and not rush. The weeks that followed were strange and full, as the weeks after long-fought battles always are. Ruby returned to the homestead and worked it through November with the particular purposefulness of a woman who now knew with certainty that it was hers to work. The winter preparations that she had been putting off against the uncertainty of the outcome could now proceed in earnest, and she threw herself into them with a physical energy that was partly practical and partly the release of months of sustained tension. She laid in firewood, she banked the garden for winter, she repaired the barn roof before the first heavy frost, and she made a list of everything she intended to do with the east field in the spring Thomas's irrigation plan. The new crop rotation from the agricultural journal she still kept on the shelf above the fireplace. Graham came by regularly through November and December, and there was a natural quality to his visits that they both recognized and neither formally named. He helped with the barn roof, which was a substantial 2-day project, and she fed him both days, and they talked in the evenings by the fireplace with the comfortable ease of people who have moved past the stage of needing to impress each other and into something quieter and more durable. He was still living at the Miller operation, doing winter ranch work, but he mentioned once and then twice that the Millers were talking about scaling back their operation after the spring, and that his position there would likely not extend past March. He did not say this with the floating anxiety of a rootless man, but with the thoughtful quality of someone considering where a root might appropriately be put down. Ruby heard the implication clearly, but she let it live in the space between them without grabbing at it, because she had learned by now that Graham Hadley was a man who meant what he said and said what he meant, and he would speak plainly when he was ready. On a December evening when the first real snow had fallen, and the kitchen was warm with fire, and the smell of dinner and the world outside was white and still, he spoke plainly. They had finished eating and he had helped her clear the table, which he did without being asked, and without making it into a statement, simply because it seemed to him a reasonable thing to do when someone had fed you. They were standing in the kitchen in the lamplight, and she was pouring coffee, and he was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and that particular look on his face that she had come to understand preceded something he had been thinking about for a while. "Ruby," he said. "I know that tone," she said without turning around. "Do you?" She turned around with the coffee and looked at him. "You've been working up to something for about 2 weeks." The corner of his mouth moved. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone paying attention," she said, and she set the coffee on the table and stood there looking at him with her hands folded in front of her. And in the lamplight she was dark-haired and steady-eyed, and there was something in the way she stood, in the set of her shoulders, that was both the woman who had walked into a courthouse alone with a forged deed, and the woman who had laughed over coffee about a cattle drive in the rain. Graham unfolded his arms. He looked at her for a moment the way he looked at things he was taking seriously. "I know it hasn't been long," he said. "I know you've had the hardest year a person can have. I'm not asking you to rush anything or decide anything tonight. I just want to tell you the truth of where I am, because you deserve the honest version of things, and I've never been good at the half-measure version anyway." She nodded. "I have been happier in the last 2 months than I can remember being in a long time," he said, with the directness of a man who had thought about the right words and decided the honest ones were the right ones. "I want to stay in this county. I want to stay near this homestead. I want, if you are willing, to stay in your life. I'm not asking you to make a decision tonight. I am asking whether you want the same thing, and if you do, I will move at whatever pace is right for you." The kitchen was very quiet except for the fire. Ruby Baker looked at Graham Hadley in the lamplight, and thought about the morning she had walked into that courthouse alone with a dead man's deed, and a bruise fading yellow along her jaw, and the man she had almost walked into on the courthouse steps, and the 3 miles of road she had walked back to this house that afternoon while he stood at the junction and watched until she was safely on the east road. She thought about fence wire and east fields and hotel dining rooms and long November evenings by the fireplace and the specific quality of his laugh. "I want the same thing," she said. "I have wanted it for a while. I just wasn't certain of the timing." "What's the timing now?" he asked, and his voice was careful but his eyes were not. His eyes were entirely and openly hopeful in a way that she found utterly disarming. "The timing," she said, "is that we take it honestly and without rushing and see where it goes." "That's exactly the right answer," he said, and the smile that came then was the full one again, the open one, and she felt the warmth of it all the way through. He did not kiss her that evening, and she did not expect it. What he did was stay another hour by the fire, and the conversation that filled that hour was different from every conversation before it, lighter and more private, more personal, with the specific tenderness that comes when two people have confirmed to each other that they are standing on common ground. When he left, riding north through the snow and the dark, he looked back once from the end of the lane and touched the brim of his hat, and she stood in the lit doorway and watched him go, and it was entirely different from the first time she had watched him ride away. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a long and cold one in Kansas, as Kansas winters tended to be, and Ruby and Graham moved through it together in the careful, genuine way they had described. He found a position with a smaller operation closer to the Baker homestead in January, working for a local rancher named Beaumont who needed someone reliable for winter and spring management, and paid a reasonable wage for it. The Beaumont place was less than a mile from the Baker homestead, which was, Ruby suspected, not an accident, though neither of them made a formal point of it. They saw each other several times a week and on Sundays regularly, and the rhythm of it settled into something that felt less like courtship in the formal 1882 sense, and more like the natural growth of something that had been seeding in the ground since October. He met Elroy Watts socially one evening in January when Elroy stopped by the homestead with paperwork related to the final resolution of the land case. Virgil Crane had not appealed, apparently calculating that the cost of a public trial was greater than the cost of losing the Baker parcel, and the Baker homestead deed was now uncontested and fully restored to Ruby's name. Elroy and Graham sat at the kitchen table and talked for 2 hours while Ruby cooked, and the ease between them had the quality of people who understood each other's character without needing a full biography. In February, with the homestead deep in winter and the snow on the east field lying white and unbroken as far as the eye could see, Graham asked if she would walk with him out there. She put on her wool coat and they walked together through the snow to the middle of the east field, and he stood there looking out at it in all directions and said, "I want to farm this with you." She looked at him. "You've been a cowboy your whole adult life." "I've been a lot of things," he said. "I've worked cattle and trails and fences and horses. I know land, I know how to work it. I've wanted land of my own for a long time, longer than I admitted to myself." He looked at her. "I don't want to take over something that is yours. I want to be beside you in it." "That's a considerable commitment," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm a considerable committed man." She laughed a real laugh, clear in the cold air, and he smiled at the sound of it with an expression so openly fond that it made her catch her breath. "Beside me in it," she said when the laugh had settled. "That's what I want, if you want it too." She looked out at the east field, at the 320 acres lying quiet under the snow, at the land Thomas had loved and that someone had tried to steal, and that she had fought and kept and intended to tend well for the rest of her life. She thought about the spring planting, the irrigation ditch, the new crop rotation. She thought about doing all of it alone and doing all of it with Graham Hadley beside her, and the comparison was not complicated. "I want it too," she said. He took her hand then, in the cold middle of the east field, and she let him take it, and they stood together in the snow looking out at the reach of Kansas ground and sky, and neither of them said anything else, because it did not seem like the moment required any additional words. They were married in April of 1883, on a Sunday morning in the small Methodist church on the east side of Caldwell, with Elroy Watts as the only witness because it was a small and private ceremony in the way that both Ruby and Graham preferred things, real over ceremonial, honest over elaborate. Ruby wore the best dress she owned, which was a deep blue wool, and she carried a small bunch of the first prairie wildflowers that had come up along the fence line that week, yellow and thin-stemmed in the April wind. When the minister asked if Graham Hadley took Ruby Baker to be his wife, Graham looked at her directly and said "I do" with the same quality of plain-spoken certainty he brought to everything he said, and Ruby felt it in her chest like the striking of a bell, clear and resonant and lasting. Afterward, Elroy took them to the hotel dining room and paid for the meal himself, which he announced was his wedding gift and which he presented with great ceremony, and they spent the afternoon eating and talking and laughing. And when they drove home together in the wagon through the April countryside, Graham's horse tied to the back, their few combined possessions consolidated. The road was lined with new grass and the sky was the wide Kansas blue, and Ruby Baker, who was now Ruby Hadley, thought that the world had a particular beauty in it, that afternoon, that she intended to pay very careful attention to. The first spring on the homestead together was extraordinary in the particular way of things that have been worked for through real difficulty. They broke ground on Thomas's irrigation ditch in May, the two of them working side by side from early morning to late afternoon, and Graham's physical strength and Ruby's precise knowledge of where the water ran and how the field drained made the work go faster than either had expected. By June, they had a working channel that drew from the small seasonal creek at the field's north edge and distributed through the east field's lower quadrant, and the effect on the summer crop was visible and immediate. Graham proved, as he had promised, to know land. He knew it differently than Thomas had. Thomas had been an instinctive farmer, working from feel and memory. Graham was more systematic, more analytical, with the kind of practical intelligence that had managed large-scale cattle operations and could translate that organizational capacity into the different problem of farming. They complemented each other well, in the fields and in the house, and in the evenings when they sat on the porch and watched the Kansas summer unfold across the open land. He brought to the homestead a set of skills she had not had: the deep knowledge of horses and large animals, the ability to manage the practical infrastructure of a working operation with an efficiency that freed up her time for the things she did better, the cooking and preserving, and the particular intimacy with the soil that she had learned from Thomas and made her own. He learned from her, and she learned from him, and the learning was mutual and continuous, and marked by a fundamental respect for each other's knowledge that made the daily work a kind of ongoing conversation. The love between them deepened through that first year in the way that real love does, not in dramatic declarations and singular moments, but in the accumulation of small things. The morning coffee handed through the door without asking whether she wanted it, the evening when he sat up with her through the night, when one of the draft horses fell ill, the Sunday afternoons when they read different things at the same table with their feet close together, and occasionally read each other passages from whatever was in front of them. It was the love of people who had both known difficulty and loss, and who did not take the ordinary texture of a good shared life for granted. The summer of 1883 brought one last echo of the Crane matter. An investigator from Wichita arrived in Caldwell in July looking into the fraudulent deed and the expanded question of Thomas Baker's death. He came to the homestead one afternoon and spoke with Ruby for 2 hours, and Graham sat in the room throughout, not speaking unless addressed, but present in the particular way he had of being present, solid and attentive and ready if needed. The investigator's name was Crane, no relation, which Ruby noted with a dry humor that made Graham's mouth twitch. He was a thorough man, and Ruby answered his questions with the same steadiness she had brought to the courthouse hearing, the same clear memory and careful documentation. The investigation ultimately resulted in a formal indictment against Deacon Stiles for conspiracy in the fraudulent deed transaction. The question of who had actually fired the bullet that killed Thomas Baker never reached a clean legal resolution. Stiles maintained his silence on the matter, and there was no direct evidence tying Crane himself to the physical act, but the fraudulent deed, the coercion documented in Thomas's letter, and the general understanding of what Virgil Crane had been willing to do became part of the county's permanent record. It was not the complete justice that Ruby had wanted. She had wanted Thomas alive. She had wanted the world to have gone differently, back in September 1882, before the East Field and the bullet and the long months of grief and fear. No court could give her that. But the truth was on record. Her home was hers, and she had built something new on the foundation of what had been saved. And she believed Thomas Baker would have recognized the rightness of that. That fall, in October of 1883, exactly 1 year after she had walked into the Caldwell courthouse with a bruise fading yellow along her jaw and a forged deed between her fingers, and nearly walked directly into the man who would change everything, Ruby discovered she was expecting. She told Graham on a Sunday evening on the porch, the same porch where they had sat many times through the changing seasons. The October air was cool and the sky was the same wide Kansas blue as the day she had met him, and he went very still when she told him, and then he looked at her with an expression of such naked and complete joy that she felt it in every part of herself. "Are you sure?" he said, and his voice was rough with it. "Entirely sure," she said. He took her hands in both of his, and he held them for a long moment, and then he said, "I am going to be a very attentive nuisance for the next several months." She laughed. "I know, I am already preparing myself." He was, in fact, attentive in the way she had by now come to expect from him, thoroughly and practically, and without the fussiness that would have driven her to distraction. He took on more of the physical work through the winter months. He made sure the house was well supplied and well heated. He paid close attention without hovering. And on the evenings when she was tired and uncomfortable, and carrying the particular weight of late pregnancy with less grace than she would have preferred, he read to her from the newspapers and the books on the shelf above the fireplace and brought her tea and simply stayed close in the way that was its own kind of eloquence. In late May of 1884, their son was born. They named him Thomas Graham Hadley Thomas for the man who had first loved this land and first loved Ruby, a man worthy of being remembered, and Graham for the man who stood beside him in the shape of the life they were building together. The name was Ruby's idea, and Graham received it with a quiet emotion that confirmed to her she had chosen rightly. Thomas Graham Hadley arrived in the world with considerable energy, as if he had been waiting impatiently for his cue, and he was healthy and loud and thoroughly demanding in the way of babies who have decided they are the most important thing in any room, which in the Baker Hadley household he was, without contest. Elroy Watts came by the following Sunday to see the baby, bringing a gift of a beautifully bound copy of Kansas land law that he presented as a purely practical gift for the boy's eventual education, and which he clearly found hilarious. He held young Thomas Graham with the careful awkwardness of a man not accustomed to babies, and declared him the finest-looking plaintiff he had ever seen, which made Ruby laugh so hard she had to hand the baby back to Graham. That summer was the fullest they had yet known. Graham had made the decision in the spring to leave Beaumont's operation entirely and devote himself fully to the Baker Hadley homestead, and the summer proved the wisdom of it, with the irrigation ditch working well, and the new crop rotation Thomas Baker had researched producing results in the East Field soil that Ruby found genuinely remarkable. The 1884 harvest was the best in the homestead's history. They sold grain at Caldwell's market and brought in enough to repair the barn properly and invest in a new plow, and set aside a meaningful portion for the first time since Thomas Baker's death. The homestead that had once been under threat, the 320 acres that had been nearly stolen through violence and fraud, was flourishing. There was an evening in September of that year, just before the harvest, when Ruby stood at the edge of the East Field in the late afternoon light watching Graham, and a hired hand worked the last of the summer corn, Thomas Graham on her hip, the baby's fat hand gripping her collar and his head turning from side to side, with the alert fascination of a creature discovering that the world was large and interesting. The light was long and golden across the field, and the crop stood tall and green gold against the flat blue reach of the Kansas sky, and Graham looked up from the work and saw her standing there, and raised one hand in a wide, easy wave that carried all the uncomplicated ease of a man exactly where he was meant to be. She raised her hand back. The baby turned to look at whatever she was looking at, which was his father standing in the light of the east field, and made a sound of pleased recognition. This is it, Ruby thought. This is what Thomas wanted for this land. This is what was almost lost. She held it clearly in her mind, the cost of it, the fight of it, the morning she had walked into the courthouse alone with nothing but the truth and the stubborn refusal to accept that the truth could simply be ignored. She thought about Judge Haverford's dismissal, the cold, flat certainty with which he had told her that her testimony could not be entered into the record, as if she were not a person with a legitimate claim, but simply an inconvenience that the proceedings would politely step around. She thought about how close it had been, how, if she had not pushed through that courthouse door at exactly that moment, if Graham had not been standing at that hitching post with his particular quality of attention and his particular willingness to act on what he saw, the whole of it might have ended differently. She thought about what it meant that the first judge had simply declined to hear a widow's testimony. It was not cruelty. It was something in some ways worse, the smooth, casual operation of a system that saw her as less than fully relevant to the proceedings that would determine the fate of her own land, her own life, her own future. There had been nothing unusual about it, that was the thing. It was not a dramatic injustice in the loud sense. It was just the ordinary expectation that she would sit down, accept the ruling, go home, and eventually find her circumstances adjusted to accommodate Virgil Crane's requirements. She had not sat down, and Graham Hadley had not walked past. Those two facts together had changed everything. She turned from the east field and walked back toward the house, carrying her son through the last of the September afternoon, and she felt the full particular weight and gift of this life. This specific, hard-won, honest, beautiful life with every step. That winter passed in warmth and work, and the particular contentment that belongs to people who have built something real together. Thomas Graham grew in that extraordinary way of very young children, seeming to expand and transform overnight, and Graham Hadley turned out to be a father of the same quality. He was everything else: patient, attentive, unshowy, fundamentally and completely present. He read to the baby in the evenings from whatever was at hand, which meant Thomas Graham's early literary education encompassed both the Bible and a cattle almanac in roughly equal measure, which Ruby considered a perfectly balanced Kansas upbringing. In the spring of 1885, they broke additional ground on the northeast quarter of the homestead, expanding the kitchen garden to a proper market garden, and adding a small orchard of young apple and pear trees that would not bear fruit for several years, but that Graham planted with the deliberate satisfaction of a man making a long-term investment. He was, Ruby observed, no longer a man who had trouble staying in one place. He was a man who had found the place he had been looking for across the width of a continent, and who tended it with the same care and attention he brought to everything he valued. There was a letter from Missouri in March of that year, from Graham's older brother Daniel, the first communication between them in several years. Graham read it at the kitchen table with a complicated expression, and then told Ruby about it. His family, the brothers, the farm in Missouri he had left at 18, the distance that had grown through years of absence on both sides. He wrote back to Daniel that same evening, a long letter, and Ruby left him to it without asking and brought him coffee without being asked, and found him still writing when she came back from putting Thomas Graham to sleep. "I should have written sooner," he said, when he finally set down the pen. "You're writing now," she said simply. He looked at her with that expression she knew so well, the one that was fond and grateful and slightly disarmed by her all at once. "You're very good at that." "At what?" "Knowing the right thing to say." She sat down across from him. "I have had a lot of practice knowing when not to say too much," she said, with the slight smile that he had told her once was the most dangerous thing in Kansas. He folded the letter and set it with the outgoing mail, and then sat back and looked at her across the kitchen table with the lamplight warm between them. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was a direct question in the way of all his direct questions, and it deserved a direct answer. She thought about it honestly for a moment, the full reality of it, the loss that was still real and always would be, Thomas Baker in the East Field, the months of grief and fear and fighting, and alongside it and through it and forward from it this life she had built and was building with this man. The fullness of it was not simple. It was not the absence of difficulty or sorrow. It was something richer and more durable than either of those, a wholeness, a groundedness, the specific kind of happiness that knows the cost of what it has. "Yes," she said. "Genuinely, thoroughly, yes." He nodded, and the satisfaction in his face was quiet and complete. 2 years after young Thomas Graham came into the world in the summer of 1886, their daughter arrived. She had Ruby's green eyes and Graham's dark hair, and from her first day on the earth, an extremely developed and thoroughly inconvenient opinion about everything. They named her Margaret, for Graham's mother, and called her Maggie from the first week, because Margaret was not a name that seemed to fit the personality. Maggie Hadley was a force of nature in miniature, opinionated, fearless, and possessed of a laugh that seemed too large for her small person. Thomas Graham, who was 2 when she arrived, was initially suspicious, and then rapidly fascinated, and then thoroughly attached, in the way of older siblings who discover that the new arrival is actually more interesting than they expected. Graham watched his children together with an expression that Ruby came to think of as the one he saved for things he had not known he needed until he had them. The homestead by the late summer of 1886 was a thriving, fully working farm. The East Field's production had increased over 3 years of improved practices to the point where they were recognized at the Caldwell market as one of the more productive grain operations in the South County. The orchard was young but growing. The kitchen garden supplied both the household and a regular surplus that Ruby sold to the hotel kitchen in Caldwell every week through the growing season. They had hired a part-time farmhand named Pete, a young man from Oklahoma who was learning the work and learning it well. There was a moment in August of that year, a Sunday afternoon with the children napping and the house quiet and the summer heat lying soft over the East Field, when Ruby and Graham sat together on the porch steps, sharing a bottle of cold water in the same way they had sat on those same steps with coffee in November of 1882, on the afternoon of the day they had fixed the north fence. The porch was the same. The Kansas sky was the same. The East Field spread out before them with the same black, rich soil and the same wide reach toward the horizon that Thomas Baker had loved. But everything was different. Everything was full. Graham put his arm around her shoulders, an easy, familiar gesture, and she leaned into him in the comfortable way of people who have spent enough time together that the shapes of each other have become natural. They sat in the August afternoon and looked out at the East Field, at the place where the irrigation ditch caught the light and ran silver through the crops, at the young orchard on the northeast quarter where the trees were beginning to look like real trees, at the wide sky above it all. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She considered. "I am thinking about the courthouse," she said. "That morning." He nodded slowly. "I have thought about it a great deal," she said. What it meant that he simply said no. That he said a widow's testimony could not be entered, as if the law had already accounted for me and found me insufficient. It had, Graham said, with the careful honesty that was his way. That was the law as it was written and practiced. It was wrong. It was wrong, she agreed. And it happens to a great many women and a great many people with less than Virgil Crane has, every day in courtrooms across this country. The law takes a long time to hear certain voices. She said this not with bitterness but with the clear-eyed acknowledgement of someone who has looked directly at an injustice and refused to pretend it was not there. She had won her particular battle. She knew there were others who did not, who walked out of those courtrooms and kept walking with nowhere to go, their testimony unrecorded, their land lost, their evidence dismissed. "The world changes," Graham said after a moment, "slowly, imperfectly, But it changes. It changes when people stand up, she said, when they refuse to walk past it. He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that she recognized as the quality he had when something mattered to him deeply, and he was not trying to hide that it did. "You didn't give up," he said. "That morning, you walked out of that hearing room and you were still standing. You didn't fold." "I almost did," she said honestly. "You didn't," he said simply. She thought about the moment on the courthouse steps when she had pushed through the door and almost walked into him, and everything that had followed. A single moment. A single man standing at a hitching post with the particular quality of attention that meant he saw more than most people bothered to see. A single choice on both their parts to stay and fight. "I'm glad you were standing at that hitching post," she said. He smiled, the warm, full smile. "Best piece of luck I ever had," he said. She laughed and leaned into his shoulder, and they sat together in the August afternoon, in the life they had built, while across the east field the Kansas light moved and changed the way it always did, golden and wide, and without apology. Elroy Watts visited them for the last Sunday of August with his young nephew in tow, a visit that had become something of a tradition in the Baker Hadley household. He brought the nephew, a serious young boy named Frederick who was apparently considering the law, and spent most of the afternoon talking enthusiastically about 2 new Kansas property cases he was working on while eating Ruby's pie with the thoroughness of a man who took his pie seriously. At one point, with the children playing in the yard and Graham helping Frederick understand the working of the irrigation ditch, and Elroy sitting on the porch with a second slice of pie, Elroy looked at Ruby with the comfortable candor of a man who had been her friend long enough to say what he thought. "You know," he said, "when I walked into that courtroom in October of 1882 with 20 minutes to spare and a motion I had drafted in 40 minutes and a judge who was not happy to see me, I thought we had about a 40% chance of making it stick." "That low," Ruby said. "Haverford was not inclined to be inconvenienced," Elroy said. "And Fitch is good. He is genuinely good, which is extremely irritating." He took a bite of pie. "But the truth was on your side, and the law, properly applied, was on your side, and you had the clearest documentation I have seen in a property case in 15 years. He paused. "And you had Graham, who has the particular quality of a man the world takes seriously when he says a thing is wrong." Ruby looked out at the yard, at Graham crouching by the irrigation channel showing Frederick where the grade changed and explaining the engineering of it with the patient clarity of a man who liked teaching. "He does have that quality," she said. "He's a good man, Ruby," Elroy said, simply and directly. "He was a good man before you, and he is a better man now in the way that good people make each other better. It is a pleasure to observe." She looked at him. "That is a very generous thing to say." "I am a very generous man," Elroy said with perfect seriousness, and took another bite of pie. The afternoon stretched into evening, and Pete the farmhand stopped by on his way from the barn to the bunkhouse to let Graham know that the mare, who had been showing signs of colic, seemed considerably improved and was eating normally again, which was the first wholly good news on that front in 3 days, and which made Graham visibly relieved in the way of someone for whom the welfare of animals was a genuine personal matter. Elroy and Frederick departed at dusk, riding back toward Caldwell with Frederick full of questions about drainage engineering that Elroy deflected expertly by redirecting them toward land law, which was more his territory. After they had gone, Ruby and Graham put the children to bed together. Thomas Graham, who was 2 and had decided bedtime was an opportunity for negotiation, and Maggie, who at 8 months had the opposite approach, falling asleep with such sudden completeness that it always made Graham laugh quietly, so as not to wake her. They stood in the doorway of the children's room in the lamplight, looking at the 2 small sleeping shapes, and Graham put his hand on Ruby's back in the simple, steady way he had. "We did all right," he said very quietly. "We did," she agreed. They walked back through the house together, this house that she and Thomas Baker had built in the summer of 1879, and that had been defended and kept and filled and was now theirs, hers and Graham's and their children's, full of the evidence of the life being lived inside it. Thomas Baker's agricultural journal still sat on the shelf above the fireplace, spine-worn, with Graham's notes in the margins now alongside the original annotations, a small record of continuity and change all at once. The original homestead deed, fully restored and uncontested, sat in the small cedar box in the bedroom where Ruby had always kept it, alongside the letter Thomas had written in September of 1882, which she had never removed and never would. They sat by the fire in the October evening. It was October again. The one-year anniversary of the court hearing had come and gone in November, and they had marked it quietly and without ceremony, the way they marked most things, and Graham reached for the book he had been reading, and she reached for the newspaper from Wichita, and they sat in the lamplight with their feet close together on the hearth, and the fire doing what fires do, warm and steady and alive. After a time he set down his book and looked at her, and she felt it and looked up from the newspaper. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just looking at you." She held his gaze for a moment, and in the firelight she felt again what she had felt so many times in the years since October 1882, that specific, complete, genuine happiness that knows what it cost and is grateful for every part of it. "Graham Hadley," she said. "Ruby Hadley," he said, with a warmth in the words that never got old. She smiled. He smiled. Outside, the October wind moved across the Kansas plain, across the east field lying quiet under the first autumn moon, across the 320 acres of black rich land that had been fought for and kept and was flourishing. And inside the house that sat at the north quarter of it, the fire burned warm and steady, and the two people beside it stayed, as they had agreed to stay, together. In the years that followed, the Baker Hadley homestead became something of a quiet fixture in the Caldwell community, not famous, not grand, but known and trusted in the way of places that are genuinely well tended. They added a proper smokehouse in 1887 and a new chicken coop the following year, and the northeast orchard began bearing its first real fruit in the spring of 1889, which Graham received with the specific satisfaction of a man who had planted something and had the patience to wait for it. Thomas Graham Hadley grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the East Field with the same quality his mother did, instinctively, from the soil up, and who had, at 7 years old, the reading habit of a much older person and the practical capability of someone who had grown up, understanding that land required active engagement. Maggie Hadley grew into everything her early personality had promised: fearless, funny, more opinionated than anyone in the county, and not in the least apologetic about it, with her mother's green eyes and the particular combination of her parents' stubbornness and her father's steady warmth. In the spring of 1889, Ruby learned she was expecting again. She told Graham on a Sunday morning over coffee, watching his face, and found in it exactly the joy she had found the first time, undiminished, with perhaps an additional depth that came from knowing more fully what it meant. Their second son was born in November of 1889, just as the first hard frost settled on the Kansas plain. They named him Daniel James Hadley Daniel for Graham's brother, with whom he had rebuilt a real correspondence over the intervening years, and James for Ruby's father, gone long before Kansas but not forgotten. Daniel James arrived with considerably less drama than his brother and sister had managed, and settled into the household with a calm, watchful quality that made Graham say, on his second day in the world, that he already looked like a man who was thinking something over. 3 children, the Baker Hadley homestead, the East Field in full flourishing production, the young orchard putting out its second full harvest, the irrigation ditch that Thomas Baker had designed and Graham Hadley had built, and that ran silver through the best soil in South Harlan County. The cedar box in the bedroom with the original deed and the September letter. The agricultural journal with 2 sets of handwriting. The porch where you could sit in any season and look out at the east field and the wide Kansas sky and feel the full specific weight of what had been saved and what had been built. It was a Tuesday evening in the May of 1890 when Ruby sat at the kitchen table writing a letter to a neighbor woman, a young widow named Clara Jennings, who had recently come up against a property question of her own, the kind of question that Ruby recognized with the particular certainty of someone who had been there. She wrote carefully and thoroughly, explaining what documentation to gather and which questions to ask, and the name of Elroy Watts, who was still practicing in Caldwell and still taking cases at rates that accounted for circumstances. And she wrote it with the full weight of everything she had learned on that October morning 8 years ago, when she had walked into a courthouse alone and been told that her voice could not enter the record. She sealed the letter and set it with the outgoing mail and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table, thinking about Clara Jennings and all the other women like her, the ones the courts had not yet fully learned to hear. Graham came in from the barn where he had been finishing the evening chores. He washed his hands at the basin, dried them, came to the table and set his hand briefly on her shoulder in passing. She put her hand over his for a moment. "Writing to Clara?" he asked. "Done now," she said. "I've told her about Elroy and about keeping the original documentation." "She'll be all right," Graham said, "if she fights." "She'll fight," Ruby said, with the certainty of someone who had recognized something in a neighbor woman's face when they had spoken on Sunday. "She has that look." "What look?" he asked. "The look of someone who has decided not to accept what they've been told to accept," she said. "I know it because I had it." He looked at her with the warm, steady expression that was as familiar to her now as the east field and the porch and the sound of the fire in winter. "You still have it," he said. She looked up at him. "Good," she said simply. He bent down and kissed the top of her head in the quiet, easy way of a man entirely at home in the life he was in, and went to start the kettle for the evening tea. Outside, the May evening was warm and light was still in the western sky, that long Kansas dusk that went on, as if the day was reluctant to let go. The east field was planted for the season, the furrow straight and dark and promising, the irrigation ditch running clean and steady along its northern edge. The orchard was white with late blossom. Somewhere in the house, Thomas Graham and Maggie were involved in an argument whose precise nature was unclear but whose energy was considerable, and baby Daniel was apparently entirely at peace with all of it, as was his emerging custom. Ruby Baker Hadley listened to her house and her family and the Kansas evening, and she held in her mind the full picture of it, the 8 years of it, from the courthouse steps to here, all of it real and costly and fought for and worth every step. The man standing at the hitching post, the letter in the cedar box, the east field at sunrise, the children sleeping in the lamplight. She had not been wrong that October morning to trust the truth and walk through the door, and he had not been wrong to stand at the hitching post and see her clearly, and to spend his one good favor on a woman he did not know but whose cause was just and whose truth deserved a room where it could be heard. The tea kettle began to whistle on the stove. Graham called something cheerful through the house about the argument upstairs needing to resolve itself before the children wanted any supper. Ruby Hadley stood up from the kitchen table, tucked Clara Jennings's letter in the outgoing mail, and went to pour the tea.